Hello and welcome to Chapter 5, everyone. Chapter 5 is going to deal with some cash control systems, and we want to be thinking about for our businesses that we need to have some measure to keep track of our cash. And the reality is, if we were operating our business and using large amounts of cash to pay for things, then we probably would run the risk that our record keeping is not going to be very good. So up until now, we've talked about cash and we've just used cash as the example. But we want to be thinking about, in terms of our business, is that a lot of cash as it relates to the business actually refers to money that we're putting into a checking account. So lesson 5.1 actually deals with checking accounts. And the learning objectives for this lesson would be how to record a deposit on a check stub, how to endorse checks using 3 different kinds of endorsements, blank, special, and restrictive, and then how to prepare a check stub and also a check. So first of all, we just want to be aware that businesses, when they're using cash, typically true cash is related to small payments. And because of that, if we're using a lot of cash, we really run the risk that we might make errors. We run the risk that we don't have proper documentation about ownership. And quite frankly, we run the risk of loss if we are using all cash. So anytime businesses use true cash, they need to have some safety measures in place just to make sure that cash is being handled responsibly. Now, for the sake of most businesses, pretty much all transactions dealing with money are going to be done using a checking account. Okay, so it's just saying the business form that orders a bank to pay cash from their bank account, this is known as a check. And anytime a business opens an account where they can put money in and request payment out of that account, that's called a checking account. And in order to open a checking account, businesses need to go and provide some documentation and information to the bank. And one of the things they're required to complete is called a signature card, and it's what allows the bank to actually release funds out of an account. So the signature card is actually a pretty important document. The other thing is that businesses need to know how to complete a deposit slip so that they can go ahead and put money into their account. So one of the first things that we want to make sure that we know about a deposit slip is that it's going to list more than just either cash or checks. It's the way we can record any kind of currency and get it into our account. Okay, so you can see an example of a deposit slip here, and hopefully all of you have some experience banking before now to realize that on our deposit slip we're going to have the date. We would want to make sure that we could record information about the check and the total amount of the deposit going into our account. Now, we do have the responsibility that every time in a business environment we deposit money into our account, we also need to record this on a check stub so that we have accurate records. Okay, so the first thing that we would do is write any balance brought forward in our account on our check stub. In the example we're looking at on the screen here, we're starting our account brand new from scratch. So the balance brought forward is 0, and then the very first deposit is going to happen on January 2nd, and it's going to be in the amount of $2,000. Finally, you calculate the subtotal, and the subtotal is just tied to what's going on in the account. Now, this check stub is also what you'll use when you record the very first check transaction. So that's why you stop at the subtotal line. Now, we're also throwing out a new vocabulary term called an endorsement. And an endorsement is what's on the back of the check that transfers ownership of the funds in some way. And there are 3 types of endorsements that are commonly used, and they're a blank endorsement, a special endorsement, and a restrictive endorsement. And so let's look at those. The easiest one is just a blank endorsement, and a blank endorsement is really where you just sign your name. Okay, most of you, I'm sure, if you've ever deposited a check that you received from a grandma or grandpa, and you're right at the bank, you're signing it, putting it into your account, that's a blank endorsement. Another kind of endorsement that businesses sometimes use are called special endorsements, or sometimes we refer to these as an endorsement in full. And I always use in the example of an endorsement in full. If you receive money and you would like to take the check and sign it over to someone else, then you're using a special endorsement. And I frequently will say, hey, if I got money, but I wanted to give it to my mom, and I didn't want to have to write out a separate check for her, and I didn't want to have to cash it or go to the bank myself, I could just flip the check over and put a special endorsement on it to say, pay to the order of my mom, and then sign my name, and she could then cash the check. A restrictive endorsement, this is the third kind of endorsement, and a restrictive endorsement, you want to think about, restricts what the bank is allowed to do with your check. And the restriction is most frequently for deposit only. So if you only want this check to go into your bank account, then you can put a restrictive endorsement on it. The only time you ever really want to use a blank endorsement is when you're at the bank and you're ready to actually turn the check right over to the hand of the banker who's going to cash it for you. Other times, you want to use either a special or a restrictive endorsement. I can't tell you the number of times that I worked at a bank and I was in the drive-thru, and we would have customers come through with blank endorsements, and the wind would blow their check out of the drawer as the drawer was closing, and they'd have to jump out of their car and run down the street and get the check because they had endorsed the check using a blank endorsement, which means that anybody could have cashed that check. So if you think about it, it's kind of amusing to envision people jumping out of their car doors to run down the street to collect checks on a windy day. So only ever use a blank endorsement if you know for 100% that that check is going to be readily in somebody else's hands, so that it's not cashable by someone else. Now, the next thing we're looking at here is a completed check stub and then the actual check. So you can see on the check stub where we brought the balance information subtotal forward previously for that $2,000. The next thing that we're going to do, because we're going to be writing a check out to Eastside Supplies, is writing this information on the check stub first. This probably goes contrary to what you've seen mom and dad doing with their actual checking accounts, but the reality is that good record keeping means we write the stub first to make sure we have all of the information and to make sure we have enough money in our account before we're writing any checks. So the first thing we would do is write the amount, the date, who we're actually sending the money to. In this case, it's Eastside Supplies. And then we're going to go ahead and write the purpose of the check on the stub. So for supplies. Business accounts, you always want to indicate what the check is for. That's a little bit different than our personal accounts where we have some flexibility, and you can, if you don't want to, you don't really have to. But for business accounts, you should always be indicating what that check is for. Then you go ahead and write the amount of the check on the stub. And then you go ahead and subtract and get your balance forward information so that you know the balance that you're going to carry forward before you write your next check is that $1,835. So the $2,000 minus the $165. The final step then would be to actually go ahead and write the check. So you're going to put the date on your check and who it's for. Remember, when you're writing checks, you should always start at the very left-hand side where it says pay to the order of. Don't leave any space. If you leave space, then people can potentially add information. I always recommend also that you draw a line after whoever you're writing the check to so that somebody can't add. Looks like on this check, I could potentially add Eastside Supplies or Christina Bloomquist, and then if I got my hands on this check, I could cash it myself. Okay. The other part you want to do is write the amount of the check in figures, so 165.00. And then you want to write the amount of the check in words, 165, and you can see no over 100. The other thing you want to remember when you're looking at this 160-5, you always hyphenate numbers from 21 to 99. Numbers below 20, you don't have to hyphenate. The purpose of the check always goes on the for line. And then finally, you sign the check. And in this case, Michael Delgado, he is the owner of the Delgado Web Services, so he is signing this check. Now, if you make a mistake and you need to void a check, first of all, you write void in big capital letters on the check, and then you go ahead and post in your journal that the check was voided. So you record the date that the check is voided, the check number, and then go ahead, put a check mark in the post reference column and dash out both the debit and credit lines. So, quick audit of our understanding. 3 types of endorsements. We should be able to identify all 3. The steps that we need to prepare a check stub, and the steps to prepare the check. Please also remember that you want to make sure you do the stub first before you write the check. Looks like that's the end of lesson 1 in chapter 5. So after this, you want to go ahead and do the form online, then the work together and on your own activities. Good luck.